Okay, so that even though we might be talking about sort of the idea of assimilation, of migration, of social pressure, of social norms, of conformity, what we're not talking about in any of this discussion of sort of Americanization, Germanization, Italianization, is we're not talking about the biological destruction of a group, right? Still, we're not talking about the biological destruction of a group. If individuals defect from, Poland to the United States, and there is pressure for them to speak English, and there is pressure for them to dress in a certain manner, or eat certain foods, or, carry themselves in a certain way in public, these pressures are sort of like the typical pressures that one assumes, right? If there's an imposition, however, and people say, well, what you used to do back home you can't do here, even that isn't as extreme as the attempt to destroy all of those members, if it's Poles, if it's Jamaicans, if it's Haitians, if it's Cubans, whatever it might be. That on no sense is this pressure for assimilation synonymous with biological destruction, right? The whole point of assimilation is that you want to incorporate individuals into your society. There is a desire by those who are citizens of the society to incorporate foreigners, but there has to be an exchange, right? You have to conform, we have to conform, so on and so forth. In genocide, there is no conformity, right? There is no assimilation. That's the point, right? The point is that genocide does not recognize, in any sense, pressures of assimilation. There will be no pressure for assimilation because it's about destruction, right? We want to destroy this group, and Lemkin wants to make that distinction clear. What he does is, Lemkin, this idea of genocide, it seems now so obvious, but actually at the time, his idea of genocide sort of went against years of good philosophical and political theory, right? Social political theory, proper poli-sci. Most of his account of genocide at the time was a slap in the face to the canon, right? The tradition. Primarily the following. It's known as the Russo, O-U-S-S-E-A-U. P-O-R-T-A-L-I-S, right? So the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, right? The Russo-Crotalus doctrine. First, I'm going to read what it is, the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, and I'm going to read exactly what Rousseau says it is, right? How Rousseau himself defines it. Then we'll see how genocide is different, right? And I'll try and make this clear. So, prior to Raphael Lemkin, Rousseau, great legal theorist, great political philosopher, Rousseau he talks about many things like general will. He talks about this theory that I'm going to talk about now. So in the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, the idea is the following, right? The idea is this: war is something that occurs not between man and man, but between states. The individuals who become involved in it are enemies only by accident. They fight not as men or even citizens, but as soldiers. Not as members of this or that national group, but as its defenders. A state can have as its enemies only other states, not men at all. Seeing that there can be no true relationship between things of a different nature. The object of war being the destruction of the enemy, state, a commander has a perfect right to kill its defenders so long as their arms are in their hands. But once they have laid them down and have submitted, they cease to be enemies, or instruments employed by an enemy, and revert to the condition of men, pure and simple, over whose lives no one can any longer exercise a rightful claim. These principles derive from the nature of things and are found upon reason. Okay, so the Russo-Crotalus doctrine states the following. What was the point of what I just read, right? Well, let me draw a visualization, right? What Russo is saying is that he's making a distinction between two things, right? We'll imagine that X is the individual. And we'll say the individual human being. Right? He uses the term man, but the same. The individual human being, right? And this circle represents the state. Okay? So the circle represents the state, X represents the individual human being. What Russo is saying in the Russo-Crotalus doctrine is the following. He's saying that anytime we're talking about war, right, an act of war, anytime you use the word war, by war, we immediately mean, right, when we use the term war, an attack between states, right? It's conflict. It's physical violence between states, right? So that anytime we're talking about war, this is the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, right? D-O-C-T-R-I, right? That we wage war against the state, right? War is waged against the state. Russo specifically says that war is never waged war properly, right? An act of murder maybe, but not an act of war. An act of war, according to the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, is the assumption, is the statement, is the claim that war is waged against the state and only against the state. Russo specifically says that war, according to him, is never waged against individual human beings, right? War is waged against the state, not human beings. He says the object of war being the destruction of the enemy state. But once they have laid them down, that is the defenders of the state, the human beings, once they have laid them down, their arms, and submitted, they cease to be enemies or instruments employed by an enemy and revert to the condition of men, pure and simple, right? So, once they revert to the condition of men, they're no longer defending the state, and they're just existing as human beings. We no longer, in an act of war, are justified in targeting, in exterminating human beings, right? We are only justified in exterminating human beings if they are functioning as defenders of the state. According to the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, if a human being, individual man, is in an act of war functioning as a defender of the state, then opposing states have every right to kill this individual. Why? Because he is not representing himself. He's not autonomous in a sense. He is a representation, a defense of the state. And since we are attacking the state, we can attack the individual, right? But there's never a direct attack on the individual, according to the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, as for the reasons I just read, right? As soon as he lays his arms down and he is no longer a defender of the state, he reverts to being a regular guy, and you can't kill regular people. That's basically what he's saying. The problem is, however, that Lemkin wants to challenge this. This is exactly what Lemkin is arguing against, right? Lemkin is saying, Rousseau, that may have been the case, right? And technically speaking, it probably was never the case, because genocide sort of predated even Rousseau. We never had the word for it. The vernacular wasn't there, but the acts certainly were. What ends up happening is that the act of genocide is specifically, right? The act of genocide is specifically an argument against sort of this Rousseauian doctrine, right? The Russo-Crotalus doctrine does not apply to acts of genocide, specifically because acts of genocide are not targeted against the state. Acts of genocide are targeted against individual human beings. Insofar as acts of genocide are targeted against human beings, specifically biological entities, and not national sovereignty, the Russo-Crotalus doctrine could not be incorporated into Lemkin's account of genocide, right? And Lemkin's understanding and Lemkin's account of genocide, what he specifically wanted to do is to analyze the distinction between the Russo-Crotalus doctrine and to say that there is this new form of warfare. This new form of warfare. And this is a key point, because I still don't think that people recognize that genocide is a form of war. Right? People look at genocide as, they demonize, they think that, you know, to commit an act of genocide you have to be a heathen, right? That you have to be a sadist, that you can't be rational, right? So you'll have a whole bunch of psychological theory talking about the insanity of all these people, right? And there might be some validity to that. I personally don't buy it. I don't believe it. I think you can be completely sane. The act of genocide is an act of war. right? It can be used as an act of war. It is an immoral act. It is an illegal act, something that we might talk about. But it is an act of war. There is as bizarre and as perverse as it is, there is a logic, right, to the use of genocide as an act, as a tool of war. Most people don't recognize this, and Lemkin from the very beginning stated that genocide, in a critique against sort of the Russo-Crotalus doctrine, genocide is now being used as an act of war against individual human beings, against individual biological entities, rather than national sovereignty. And here's what it is.